A soft hiss escaped from Isabel's lips as she stepped onto the marble floor of the grand hotel ballroom. The place was like something out of a fairy tale. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the crowd of impeccably dressed elites. Her hand instinctively grasped the edge of her simple dress, fingers trembling from the weight of her insecurity. This was a world she didn't belong to, and the whispers, the glances, confirmed it. But she wasn't going to let them see her fear. Not tonight. She forced her shoulders back, lifting her chin, despite feeling like the eyes of the entire room were on her. Then, out of nowhere, she heard a voice behind her, smooth and cool as ice. "Do you need help, or are you just planning on blending in with the wallpaper?" Isabel whipped around to find him, Dominic Hayes, the billionaire neurosurgeon. He stood tall, his sharp, angular features lit by the chandelier's light. His dark eyes scanned her face, unreadable, almost as if he were dissecting her. His reputation preceded him, and if anyone was going to be the talk of the room, it was him. Yet, here he was, speaking to her like she was someone he actually cared about. She straightened, suddenly aware of how out of place she was. "Excuse me," she managed to say, a defensive note creeping into her voice. His lips quirked into the smallest of smiles. "The way you're standing there like you might disappear into the floor any second. Either you need help or you're lost." "I'm fine, thank you." Isabel's voice was strained, but she didn't know how to hide the truth. She was lost in this world, completely lost. Dominic's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and just when she thought he was going to turn away, he spoke again. "You're a guest, aren't you?" "Yes," Isabel replied, her heart beating faster. She didn't know why she felt exposed under his scrutiny, but she did. He nodded slowly, considering her for a second longer before stepping closer. "If you're trying to avoid a scene, I suggest you let me help. You don't belong here, and I can tell you're about to be embarrassed." She stiffened, refusing to show him how much his words stung. She had to prove him wrong. "I'll be fine," she insisted, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Dominic's lips twitched again, and he seemed to think for a moment. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How about this? You pretend to be my date for the night, and I'll make sure no one dares make you feel out of place. Deal." Isabel blinked at him, completely caught off guard. She opened her mouth to refuse, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "I know what you're thinking," he said, almost reading her mind. "You're not my type, but we both know that's not what this is about. It's about saving face." Isabel hesitated. The thought of being a pawn in his game, pretending to be something she wasn't, stung. But then she thought of her mother, lying in a hospital bed, the mounting medical bills, and the constant stress on her shoulders. She swallowed hard. "Fine," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. "I'll do it." And just like that, Isabel was caught up in the whirlwind of Dominic Hayes. Life, a life she never expected to be part of. Hello, family, and welcome to Fiction Stories TV. If you love deeply emotional stories about love, loss, and unexpected reunions, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone you care about. Don't forget to turn on your notifications so you never miss a new story from us. Your support truly means everything. Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Isabel was at a crossroads, and she knew it. She had just agreed to become Dominic's fake girlfriend for a night, a small price to pay for the kind of financial relief her mother needed. But the moment she agreed, she couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. This was a man she'd never imagined being in her orbit. He was rich, powerful, and emotionally unavailable. At least, that's what the gossip columns said. His life was a world she could never fit into, and yet, she had been pulled into it without warning. She took a deep breath as Dominic led her through the sea of glittering guests. His presence was commanding, but there was something about him that made her feel small, insignificant. His tailored suit looked like it had been made for a king, the crisp lines sharp against his broad shoulders, his dark hair perfectly in place. Every woman in the room seemed to glance at him with awe, and Isabel couldn't understand why he would even consider associating with someone like her. At least that's what she thought until he turned to her with that small, knowing smile. "Just follow my lead and everything will be fine," he said, his voice low and confident. "I'll keep the vultures off your back." For a moment, Isabel couldn't help but wonder what kind of man he really was. Dominic Hayes wasn't a man who believed in love. At least that's what he told himself. It was easier that way. He didn't need to let anyone in, didn't need to show weakness. Not after everything he had been through. Not after his marriage to Catherine, the scandal that had left him a shell of the man he once was. The last thing Dominic needed was another complication. But there was something about Isabel, the way she didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't, the way her presence didn't come with a hidden agenda. She was out of place in this world, sure, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, Dominic found himself intrigued. She wasn't like the others, and maybe that was exactly why he couldn't let her go. But he couldn't allow himself to fall for her. He couldn't risk it. The evening went by in a blur. Dominic and Isabel were the talk of the night. She played her part perfectly, smiling, laughing, and fitting into the role he'd created for her. It was easy to pretend, especially when everyone in the room believed the lie. But in the quiet moments, when their eyes met across the room, Isabel couldn't help but wonder if he saw through her facade. Did he know that she was pretending, or was he pretending too? By the time the evening came to an end, Isabel had had enough. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of her role, the endless smiles, or the subtle touches Dominic had given her throughout the night, but something was shifting in her. She was no longer just playing a part. She was starting to feel things, real things, things she didn't know how to deal with. As the night ended, Dominic leaned in close to her, his breath warm against her ear. "You did well tonight, but don't get used to this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is only a temporary arrangement." Isabel nodded, but her heart sank. She had just entered a world she didn't understand, a world that was about to pull her in deeper than she could have ever imagined. The next few weeks passed in a haze of corporate events, dinners with influential people, and public appearances. Isabel had slipped seamlessly into the role Dominic had given her. At least, that's what she thought. But something inside her was changing. She couldn't ignore the way Dominic's touch lingered a little longer than necessary when they posed for photos, or the soft look he gave her when no one was watching. She thought it was all for show, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she saw something else behind his eyes, something real. Each time their hands brushed, her breath caught in her chest. Each time he smiled at her, she felt a flutter in her stomach, an unfamiliar warmth that settled deep in her core. Isabel tried to ignore it, tried to remind herself that this was just a contract, just a deal. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get involved. But as much as she tried to push it down, the truth began to seep through. She was falling for him. Dominic, on the other hand, was a master of controlling his emotions. He had built walls so high around himself that nothing could get through. He wasn't about to let a woman like Isabel tear those walls down, not again. But every time he looked at her, every time he caught her laughing with someone else or smiling at him across a crowded room, something inside him stirred. Something he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, he found himself wanting more than just the surface level, more than just a business arrangement. And that terrified him. He couldn't afford to fall for her. Not now, not after everything he'd been through. But he couldn't seem to stay away. He found excuses to spend more time with her, to make sure she was comfortable in his world. And more often than not, he found himself looking for her in a crowded room, searching for that smile that made his heart race. It was late one evening when the breaking point came. They had just attended a charity gala, and Isabel was exhausted from hours of socializing. Her feet ached, and she longed for the quiet comfort of her own space. Dominic had noticed her fatigue, and against his usual reserved nature, suggested they leave early. "We've been here for hours," he said, his voice low and unusually gentle as he stood next to her. "Let's get out of here." Isabel glanced up at him, surprised by his offer. Normally, he would have stayed to mingle with the important guests, but tonight, something was different. "Are you sure?" she asked, not wanting to seem too eager to leave. He nodded. "Yes, you look like you could use some rest." The car ride back to his penthouse was quiet, filled with an unspoken tension. When they arrived, Dominic escorted her to the door, but instead of retreating to his usual distant politeness, he lingered for a moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to say something without words. "You've been amazing tonight," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you." Isabel blinked, momentarily taken aback by his sincerity. "It's my pleasure." There was a long pause between them. Neither moved, both caught in the electricity of the moment. Dominic's gaze dropped to her lips, and Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the pull between them, the undeniable tension that had been building for weeks. Before she could stop herself, she leaned in slightly, her heart racing in her chest. But Dominic, ever the cautious one, pulled back just enough to break the moment. "This can't happen," he muttered, as if reminding himself more than her. Isabel froze, the words stung. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no sound came out. Instead, she stepped back, taking a moment to regain control over her emotions. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know why it hurt so much, but it did. Maybe because deep down she had known this would happen. Dominic's face softened, his lips pressed into a tight line. "You don't," he replied quietly. "I don't want this to happen either, but I don't know how to stop it." The following days felt like they moved in slow motion. Dominic kept his distance, maintaining the professional boundaries they'd agreed on. Isabel tried to keep her distance too, but she couldn't help herself. Every time he walked into a room, her heart beat faster, and every time he looked at her, she felt like she was drowning in something she couldn't control. Her feelings for him had grown stronger, more complicated, and more painful with each passing day. She had tried to keep her emotions in check, but it was impossible. How could she not fall for a man like Dominic, someone so kind, so driven, and so painfully closed off? But that was the problem, wasn't it? He was closed off, and no matter how much she wanted to break through, she couldn't. She had no idea what to do, no idea how to navigate this maze of emotions. The contract, the promise, the emotional attachment clause, it all seemed to suffocate her, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending. The breaking point came one afternoon, as they were heading to yet another high-profile event. As they made their way through the bustling crowd, Isabel felt a familiar sense of dread creeping in. She wanted to escape, to run far away from this world that made her feel so small. But then Dominic touched her arm, and her breath hitched in her throat. "You okay?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. She looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Dominic stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Do what?" "This, pretending," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't keep pretending that this arrangement doesn't mean anything to me." Hello, family, and welcome back to Fiction Stories TV. If you're enjoying the journey with Isabel and Dominic, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that tug at your heartstrings. Share this video with someone who loves a good romance, and don't forget to turn on your notifications so you never miss a new chapter. Your support truly means everything to us. Now let's dive back in. Dominic's expression darkened. "You knew what this was from the beginning," he said, his voice tight with tension. "You agreed to it, no emotions." "I know," Isabel whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But I can't help how I feel. I've tried, Dominic. I've tried so hard, but I can't do this anymore." For the first time, Dominic looked genuinely vulnerable, his eyes full of emotion he was too afraid to express. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and comforting. "I didn't want this to happen either," he said quietly. "But it has, and now, I don't know what to do about it." Isabel's heart ached. She wanted to say something, anything, that would make everything okay. But the truth was, she didn't know how to fix this. Dominic let out a deep sigh, his hand slipping away from hers. "We can't keep doing this, Isabel." Isabel nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. For the first time, Isabel wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of what they had built, real or fake. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and unspoken tension. Isabel tried her best to keep things professional, just as Dominic had demanded, but the air between them was heavy. She couldn't look at him without feeling a pang in her chest, and every time he glanced at her, his eyes seemed to be filled with a quiet sadness, like he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. They were both trapped in this arrangement, and neither of them knew how to escape it. Dominic kept his distance, his usual cold demeanor more pronounced than ever. He buried himself in work, throwing himself into surgeries and meetings to avoid facing what was brewing between them. But Isabel wasn't blind. She could see the way his jaw tightened whenever their paths crossed, the way his hand would twitch like he wanted to reach out to her but couldn't bring himself to do it. And Isabel, she was a mess. She felt like she was suffocating in her own emotions, torn between the contract she had agreed to and the undeniable feelings she had for him. Every time she looked at him, her heart ached. It wasn't just the physical attraction. It was the way he listened to her, the way he protected her in subtle ways, the way he made her feel like she mattered in a world that had always made her feel invisible. But none of that mattered, did it? She had signed a contract. She had promised him that there would be no emotional entanglement, that everything between them would remain a lie. And yet, here she was, falling for him in ways she couldn't control. It wasn't until they found themselves at another event, this time a private dinner with important clients, that things finally came to a head. The room was filled with the usual crowd, business tycoons, influential doctors, and socialites, all dressed in their finest attire. Isabel had become accustomed to the cold smiles and fake pleasantries by now, but tonight, everything felt different. Dominic was standing across the room, speaking with a group of investors, his back to her. Isabel was trying to make small talk with a couple of women nearby, but her mind kept drifting back to him. She couldn't help herself. He was magnetic, even when he wasn't trying to be. His presence commanded attention, and she found herself drawn to him as if he were the sun and she, a helpless planet orbiting too close. Suddenly, she felt a tap on her shoulder, and she turned to see Clara Devereux, the socialite who had made her feel so uncomfortable at their first meeting. Clara's eyes glinted with something like amusement as she looked Isabel up and down. Well, if it is Dominic's latest plaything," Clara said, her voice dripping with disdain. Isabel's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to let Clara see how much her words stung. She had been through this before, the cold judgment, the whispers behind her back. But Clara's words cut deeper than usual tonight. Maybe it was the way Clara said it, so matter-of-factly, as if she had already decided who Isabel was. "Excuse me," Isabel managed, trying to keep her composure. Clara's lips curled into a smirk. "You really think you belong in this world, don't you?" she said, her voice sharp. "Dominic might be fooling himself, but we all know what this is. It's just a temporary distraction for him, and once he's bored with you, he'll move on to the next one, so don't get too comfortable." Isabel felt her cheeks flush, her pulse racing. But before she could respond, she saw Dominic walking toward them, his face unreadable. The moment he approached, Clara straightened and gave him a wide smile. "Dominic," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We were just having a little chat. I was telling Isabel here how lucky she is to be in your company." Dominic's eyes flicked between Isabel and Clara, and Isabel could see the tension in his jaw, the way his posture stiffened. He was always so careful about keeping up appearances, but tonight, something inside him snapped. He didn't say a word to Clara. Instead, he stepped forward, his hand gently, almost protectively, placing itself on Isabel's lower back. "You're mistaken, Clara," Dominic said, his voice cold and commanding. "Isabel doesn't need your approval." The words were simple, but there was a finality to them that made Clara's expression falter for a moment. Then, without another word, Dominic turned to Isabel and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You okay?" he asked, his voice much softer than it had been moments before. Isabel nodded quickly, surprised by the tenderness in his tone. She had expected him to retreat into his usual icy demeanor, to pretend that nothing had happened. But instead, there was something raw, something vulnerable in his gaze. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she was. Her heart was racing, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The sting of Clara's words had cut deep, but the way Dominic had defended her, without hesitation, without calculation, left her speechless. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the world pressing down on them. Isabel wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. She didn't know how to put into words the way her chest tightened every time Dominic looked at her like that, like she was someone worth protecting, worth defending. But before she could speak, Dominic turned his back on her, walking toward the group of investors he had been talking to earlier. Isabel watched him go, a sinking feeling in her stomach. She felt so lost, so confused. For the first time, she couldn't even tell if she was more afraid of the contract she had signed or of the way her heart was starting to ache every time he looked at her. The night dragged on, but Isabel couldn't focus. The room felt suffocating, the laughter of the guests ringing in her ears. She felt like she was drowning in her own emotions, unable to breathe, unable to escape. By the time the event ended, Isabel was exhausted, not just from the long night, but from the turmoil inside her. She hadn't expected to feel so vulnerable, but that's exactly what she was. Every time Dominic touched her, even in the smallest way, every time his gaze lingered on her, she felt like she was falling deeper into something she wasn't sure she could escape. By the time Isabel returned to the penthouse that night, her mind was spinning. She had barely spoken to Dominic after the dinner, and the silence between them felt unbearable. She wanted to talk to him, to ask him what the hell was going on between them, but she couldn't. She didn't know if she could handle the truth. Dominic, however, wasn't the type to avoid difficult conversations. She knew that much about him. So when he walked in an hour later, the silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Isabel was sitting on the couch, staring out the window at the city lights. She could hear him enter the room but didn't turn around. "You're not sleeping?" he asked, his voice a little less distant than before. "No," she replied quietly. "I've been thinking." Dominic stood in the doorway for a moment before he walked over and sat next to her. "About what?" "About us," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "About this arrangement, and about what we're doing to each other." There was a long pause before he answered. "I don't know what to say, Isabel." Neither of them said anything for a moment. The air between them was thick with the weight of everything they hadn't said. But for the first time, Isabel felt like she couldn't hold back any longer. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Dominic," she said, her voice cracking as the words left her mouth. His eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. And for the first time, Isabel didn't care if it was the worst thing she could say. It was the truth. Dominic was silent for a long moment. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog, suffocating and still. Isabel could feel her heart racing in her chest, the truth now out in the open, and she hated how vulnerable she felt. She had said it. She had admitted it aloud. But now that the words were out, they were so much heavier than she had imagined. "I didn't want this," Dominic said finally, his voice soft but strained. "I didn't want to fall for you, Isabel, but I've been fighting it for so long." He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something raw in his eyes, something that wasn't guarded, wasn't distant. Her breath caught. "So what does that mean?" she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling heavily. "It means I've been trying to keep my distance. I've been telling myself this is just business, that I'm doing what's right for you, for your family. But it's more than that now. I don't know how to handle it." Isabel swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. "I can't stop myself from feeling this way about you, Dominic, and I don't think I want to anymore. The contract, it's suffocating me, but I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I can keep pretending. I don't know if I can live with myself knowing what I feel for you." She turned away from him, staring out the window at the city below. The words had come out like a flood, raw and unguarded, but now she felt exposed. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't want to face him, didn't want to see the confusion, the conflict in his expression. Dominic stood up and walked over to her, standing behind her. His presence was like a wall at her back, solid and unwavering. She could feel his warmth, and for a moment, the space between them felt unbearable. "I don't know if I can do this," he said softly, his voice low, "but I don't want to lose you either." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly to face him, her eyes searching his face for some kind of answer, some indication of what he wanted. But he wasn't looking at her in the way he usually did, not with that calculating, emotionally distant gaze. No, this was different. This time, his gaze was filled with a kind of vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. "What do you want from me, Dominic?" she asked quietly. The question had been on her lips for days, but she hadn't been able to ask it until now. She needed to know, needed to understand what he was feeling. If they were going to continue down this path, they needed to be honest with each other. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he thought carefully about his next words. I want you, Isabel, but I'm afraid. I've built my life on control, on keeping people at a distance, and you're breaking through all of that. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I can love someone the way they deserve to be loved." Isabel's eyes softened as she listened to him. She understood the fear in his voice, the hesitation. She had felt it too. She had been afraid of this from the moment they had started this arrangement, but now she knew that fear wasn't going to hold them back anymore. "I don't know if I'm ready either," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending, not when I feel like this, not when my heart is telling me something else." Dominic closed his eyes for a moment, as though steeling himself for the words he knew he had to say. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with a kind of determination. "We break the contract," he said firmly. "We let this, whatever this is between us, happen. I won't make you pretend anymore." Isabel's heart leapt in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was relief or fear, but all she could do was nod. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "We figure it out," Dominic said, his voice steady. "Together, no more pretending." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that everything could be as simple as he made it sound. But the reality of their situation was complicated. She had entered this world as an outsider, and now everything had changed. They both had to confront the truth of their feelings, the truth of their pasts, and whether they were ready to take that next step together. The room was silent for a moment, as the weight of their decisions settled over them. And then Dominic reached out, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. She didn't pull away. She let him touch her, let herself feel the connection that had been building between them since the very first moment they had met. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes," he replied, his voice unwavering. The following days were filled with uncertainty. Isabel wasn't sure what had changed, but something inside her had shifted. They had broken the contract, but now there was nothing to hold them together, no formal arrangement, no boundaries. Just two people trying to navigate something that was completely new to both of them. They spent more time together, their conversations deeper, more honest than they had ever been before. They shared stories from their pasts, things that neither had ever told anyone before. Isabel learned more about Dominic's painful divorce from Catherine, the woman who had broken his trust and left him guarded and closed off. Dominic learned about Isabel's struggles growing up, about the weight of her mother's illness and the financial strain it had caused her family. They spoke of their dreams, their hopes, and their fears. But even as they grew closer, there was still something between them that couldn't be ignored, the fear of what would happen when they let go of the safety net they had built. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of Dominic's penthouse, overlooking the city lights, Isabel broke the silence. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Breaking the contract, I mean." Dominic turned to her, his gaze soft. "No, not for a second." She smiled, a small, unsure smile. "Neither do I." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city below. Isabel wasn't sure where this was going, but she knew one thing: she was no longer pretending, and neither was Dominic. The next step for Isabel and Dominic wasn't going to be easy. They had come so far, but there were still so many obstacles ahead. The world they lived in was complex, and it wasn't going to get any simpler. But for the first time, Isabel felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Dominic. As they stood together on the terrace, Isabel realized something she hadn't fully understood until that moment. Love wasn't about control. It wasn't about contracts or rules or pretending to be something you're not. Love was about being vulnerable, about taking risks, and trusting that, together, you could figure it out. And with Dominic by her side, she was ready to take that leap. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions, the kind that make you feel alive yet uncertain at the same time. Isabel and Dominic had chosen to move forward together, but with no blueprint to follow, they were learning as they went. The walls that had once separated them, emotional barriers, unspoken rules, were crumbling, but they were still fragile. Isabel spent more time at Dominic's penthouse, the city lights below becoming a familiar comfort. They were no longer playing the part of a couple, they were a couple. But it was a delicate thing, like trying to hold sand in your hands. Every moment felt significant, every look, every word carried weight. It was impossible to deny that the connection between them had deepened in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Yet even as they moved forward, Isabel still felt the shadows of their pasts looming over them. The contract that had bound them together was gone, but its remnants lingered in the corners of her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the risks they were taking, about the reality of their differences. They came from completely different worlds. What did this all mean for their future? And what about the fallout of their decisions, the consequences they hadn't yet faced? One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Dominic's hand resting on hers, the unspoken questions lingered in the air. "I've been thinking a lot," Isabel said quietly, breaking the silence. She hesitated for a moment before meeting his eyes. "About us, about what we're doing, I know we're figuring it out. But I can't help but wonder what happens when the world catches up with us." Dominic's expression softened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "We deal with it," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "We've already taken the hardest step. We've chosen each other, Isabel. That's what matters." Isabel nodded, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest. The weight of the world was pressing down on them. Yes, they had chosen each other, but the truth of their worlds was undeniable. The divide between her life, her responsibilities, and his life, his wealth, his career, his power, felt like an insurmountable chasm. She had already seen how people looked at her, how they assumed she didn't belong. How long could they keep pretending that they didn't care? But then there was the look in Dominic's eyes when he said, "We deal with it." She realized that the confidence in his voice wasn't just about solving problems, it was about the belief that they could face anything together. And for the first time, she believed him. They spent the next few days in an almost perfect harmony. They went to dinner with friends, attended a charity auction, and traveled to a few of Dominic's business meetings. The public appearances, once daunting for Isabel, began to feel less intimidating. She wasn't just Dominic's pretend girlfriend anymore. She was someone he was choosing to share his life with, and that made all the difference. For the first time, she started to feel like she belonged in this world. Not because she was pretending to be something she wasn't, but because she and Dominic were creating something real. But as their relationship deepened, Isabel couldn't ignore the inevitable challenges. She had begun to feel a greater sense of responsibility to Dominic, not just as his partner, but as someone who was starting to love him in a way that terrified her. She wasn't just worried about the future of their relationship. She was worried about what it meant to love someone as deeply as she was starting to love him. She had already sacrificed so much for her family. What would happen if she had to choose between them and him? Could she love him the way he deserved to be loved, knowing the risks involved? It was these fears that kept her up at night, lying awake in Dominic's bed, listening to the sound of his breathing beside her, her mind spinning in circles. She wanted to believe in their future together, but every time she let her heart soften, the reality of their different worlds pulled her back into doubt. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Dominic noticed the far-off look in her eyes. She was staring at the window, watching the rain pour down outside, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her wine glass. He knew something was wrong, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. "Isabel," he said softly, breaking the silence, "what's going on in that head of yours?" Isabel looked at him, surprised by his perceptiveness. She hadn't realized how much her thoughts had been weighing on her. She opened her mouth to brush it off, but the words came out before she could stop them. "I'm afraid," she confessed quietly. "Afraid of what this is, of what it means. I'm not used to this, Dominic. I've always had to choose between my family and everything else. And now I don't know how to balance it all. I don't know how to be the person you want me to be without losing myself in the process." Dominic sat up straighter, his gaze softening. "Isabel, you're not going to lose yourself," he said, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this. I'm here and we're going to figure it out together. I know it's complicated, but we can make it work. You're not the only one who's afraid. I am too." Isabel felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she still wasn't entirely convinced. "You say that now, but the world isn't going to stop. People will talk. The pressure will build. And one day we're going to face it all, Dominic. What happens when that moment comes?" He was quiet for a moment, then spoke with quiet certainty. "Then we face it together. We don't have to have all the answers right now, but as long as we keep choosing each other, that's all that matters." Isabel met his gaze, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't have to have everything figured out. She didn't have to know exactly what the future held. All that mattered was that she and Dominic had made a choice, one that was real, one that came with risks, but also with the possibility of something beautiful. The following weeks were filled with more moments of clarity and understanding. They both let go of the fear, bit by bit. They stopped pretending, stopped hiding, and just allowed themselves to be. And while they faced obstacles, whispers from the outside world, the weight of Dominic's past, the uncertainty of the future, they knew they had one thing no one could take from them: their choice. Isabel had feared that loving Dominic would mean losing herself, but the truth was the opposite. Loving him made her feel more herself than she had in a long time. She didn't need to pretend. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be honest. Dominic, too, had learned something valuable in their time together. He had learned that love wasn't about control. It wasn't about keeping things in a neat, safe box. It was messy and complicated and beautiful, and it was worth every risk. Hello, family, and thank you for sticking with us through Isabel and Dominic's journey. If you've enjoyed this story, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could use a little love and inspiration. Don't forget to turn on your notifications so you never miss an update from us. Your support means everything. We hope this story reminds you that love isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Thank you for being a part of our Fiction Stories TV family. Until next time, take care. Isabel and Dominic had taken a risk on each other, and while the road ahead would have its challenges, they both knew that with trust, love, and a little bit of patience, they could face anything together. The world might not always be kind to them, but as long as they had each other, they had everything they needed to build the life they truly wanted.